Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel and blog. This is Jenny Hall. Thanks for joining me for another card tutorial. Today I am using the Hostess set from Stampin' Up! Called Pun Intended to make a card that has ink blending for the background. I'm using Tim Holtz Distress ink for the background coloring, and I will be using a mini ink blending tool with a sponge to actually do the blending onto the card. I'm using a MISTI stamp positioner to do my stamping today, and the reason I chose to use the MISTI instead of a clear acrylic block is that the MISTI allows me to be able to put the paper back into the unit and stamp in exactly the same spot. So after I have done some stamping and blending onto the paper, then I can put the paper back into the MISTI and go over it and kind of make my stamped image a little bolder. So I'm using this ink blending method, and I'm using the Distress inks to do the background because the Distress inks have a different look and they work a little bit differently than traditional dye inks in a stamp pad. And there's nothing wrong with using traditional stamp pad ink to do ink blending. I do it all the time, but there's a little bit something different in the chemical makeup of Distress ink because it's created to react differently with your paper. It reacts differently with water. It gives you a better blend whenever you blend the two colors together. So I wanted this blending transition to work perfectly with the least amount of effort that I needed to put into it to be able to get this entire piece of cardstock with the same blending background on it. So to use the blending tool, then you just kind of, dab it on to the little ink pad square, and then you always remove excess ink onto a piece of scratch paper or some kind of surface. My work surface that I'm working on today is freezer paper from Reynolds, and I'm using the shiny side. If you use the other side, then it's just like a regular thick butcher paper. And the reason that I'm using this is because the ink is not going to absorb into the paper. So if I want to dab off from my blending tool and be able to pick that ink back up, then it's very easy it's very similar to a craft sheet. There's a couple of companies that make craft sheets. So this is kind of along the same lines, but one roll of freezer paper that is, I think it's like 150 feet. It lasts an extremely long time, and I can just toss it. I don't have extra stuff sitting around, and I use it in my kitchen too. So it's something that I can just repurpose from inside my home. So the ink blending tool is different from a sponge dauber in the respect that a sponge dauber just sits on your finger, and it's not hard to manipulate the ink, but for me and my, I guess it would be my fine motor skills, holding on to something with my hand, with my fingers wrapped around it versus having a dauber on my finger, it works a little bit better for me to control. So that's why I chose to use the ink blending tool. It's something that if you haven't tried before, then maybe this would be a way for you to do ink blending in a little bit of a different way, or to get a different kind of final result for whatever you're looking for. You have to be very light-handed and patient. This is a very long segment of the video. I apologize. I did speed it up extremely fast. However, with ink blending, patience is what pays off. If you use a very, very light hand, very, very light touch, then that is what will allow the ink to just glide very softly across the paper, and then you're building up layers. And that's where you're going to get that transition. The ink, like the blue ink is going to mix with the purple ink once it gets to a certain point, and it's going to be blending out together very easily. The other wonderful thing about Distress ink is that it reacts quickly with water. So what I'm doing is spritzing a little bit of water onto my hand and then letting it pool and flick down onto the paper, and then dabbing it up immediately with a cloth. And what it does is it removes the ink down to a certain level. If you leave it sitting there longer, then it's going to remove more of the ink. So it gives you a little bit of a weathered look, or the bokeh effect. You can get a lot of different looks when you use Distress inks and combine them with water techniques. So this piece of paper is back in the MISTI, and the reason that I used the MISTI is because I can go back in and run exactly over the same spot on this piece of paper and have it be able to just give a little more depth to the stamped image, where it might have been a little bit more washed out looking from having the ink blending run over it. And what I'm using with the clear acrylic block is not nail polish. It's from Copic, and it's called Copic Opaque White. I mix a little bit of water with it, just to water it down a bit to where it'll move a little bit, to have a little more fluidity. And I'm going to make little specks or flecks onto the card front. And because this is a light bulb image, then I want it to kind of get something to catch the eye. And I'm using a water brush to do the flicking and not a paintbrush, because the water brush is a stiffer brush than is like one of my round brushes that I use for watercoloring. And by using a stiffer brush, then I'm going to get smaller flick spots. If I were to use a larger brush, then it would take more paint off the block at a time, and thus I would have larger flick spots, which are really great, but for this card I want to keep it small. So after I did the flicking, then of course I realized that I should have done the flicking before I went back into the MISTI. So I'm using just a black marker to go back in and make sure that the black line there didn't have any of the flicking spots on it. And it did, so I went over those and removed them so that the eye wouldn't be distracted by it. I used a tape runner adhesive. This is Fast Fuse from Stampin' Up. It is really a strong adhesive that will adhere this piece of thick cardstock to the black matte. And then I used Stampin' Dimensionals, which is self-adhesive foam spots, to raise it up just a little bit before to go onto the gray cardstock. And this is a square card versus a lot of the standard card sizes that most of us use. The finished card is measured 4 1/4 by 4 1/4. So my layers, I just brought them in just a little bit. So that'll kind of give you a guide as to if you want to make a square card versus a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 card, which is a standard card size. So I decided that after I got all of this put together, that I really wanted to have a heat embossed sentiment. I'd planned to do it on vellum, but I just like a last minute design change, which happens to, I'm sure, a lot of card makers, that while you're in the middle of making a card, then maybe you kind of change your mind to go a different way. So I use silver embossing, and to hold the embossing powder down, I use Versamark ink, which is the sticky ink for the embossing. Thanks for coming over today to join me for this video tutorial. Please give my video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Have a great day.